In this segment, I want to talk a little bit about who the economic actors are that are at play in any kind of an economy, within markets, and within society as a whole. And when we talk about economic actors, we're going to make the case that actors play, just as in theater and in movies, actors play different roles. And we'll see that these three actor groups all play different roles depending upon what the relationship is to other actors. There's also a sort of a feeling on the part of some that these groups should be called agents, particularly when individuals are involved. That's maybe more of a legal relationship, such as if I'm a manager of a business firm, I'm acting as the agent for that firm. But for our purposes right now, I think it's important we just focus on these three actor groups: households, firms or business firms, and governments. Households, firms, and governments. When we talk about households, what we're really talking about is the idea of ordinary people like you and I living together in under a same living arrangement. And oftentimes households make decisions, particularly with regard to big economic decisions: retirement, healthcare, housing, major purchases, as a single collective unit. So the term household really applies to that particular unit of individuals living together. Regardless of legal relationships, marriage, lack of marriage, it makes no difference. Economically, the economic aspect is what we're focusing on. The second actor group is business firms, and there are two characteristics that are going to qualify our understanding of business firms, and that is that they're privately owned, that is, they're not part of a government agency, and that they operate on a for-profit basis. And one of the questions that comes up from time to time is, why aren't we including not-for-profits in this particular grouping? And it isn't as though not-for-profits aren't important and don't play a major role, because they do. We're talking about hospitals, universities, foundations, religious organizations, and the like. But in many ways, their behavior, and it's really the conduct and behavior that we're interested in, is almost identical very often to those of business firms themselves. So we don't lose any accuracy by not including the not-for-profit sector. Instead, we can just sort of infer what their conduct is. And the third is government. And in this country, we have two main divisions of government: the federal government and state governments, individual state governments. This is obviously by design. When the Constitution was first created in the 1780s, there was a deliberate division between the federal government and state governments, whose respective roles have changed over many years, with federal government having much more control over economic events and regulation and whatnot, whereas state governments really are not so primary in this particular relationship. Okay? So households, firms, and governments. By the way, we can take households and firms together and group them into a collective that we'll simply refer to as the private sector. And the private sector is simply all agents who are not part of government. So if an entity is part of government, we simply refer to that and anybody who works in that particular area as belonging to the public sector. And these are terms that are likely familiar to a lot of you. Okay? So let's take these and let's do a graphic relationship of the interworkings and interrelationships among actors. And I'm going to present to you something that's going to be very straightforward, and I think it's rather easy to get our arms around. That's something called the circular flow model, which is discussed in your textbook. And in fact, if you were to do a search, internet search of the term circular flow model, you would literally get millions and millions of hits. It's a very commonly used model to depict actors and their relationships among each other in the economy more broadly. And what I'm going to give you here is going to be relatively straightforward. It's not going to be as detailed as what you might see in textbooks or on certain websites, but it does outline the basics. And even though some may differ in terms of where we place actors and whatnot, the relationships are going to be intact in any of these models. And so we'll have firms, government, and households in no particular order. I'm just doing this for the sake of convenience. The fact that government is in the middle here is not particularly revealing of the fact that government has necessarily any central role to play. We're simply putting it there because, in fact, government does tie together the activities and economic relationships between households and governments. Okay? So what is the most basic thing that could be done in economics, and that's producing output. So we say business firms produce goods that, by and large, are taken up by households. So firms produce goods that are transferred to households. And this is not a model that denies the fact that some business firms buy from other business firms. Governments buy also from firms, but 2/3 of the activity in our economy is this, transfer of goods from firms to households. And so it's a pretty important and significant relationship. Okay, what about households? What is their output? And we can say that the output of households is their labor output. So you've got this kind of wheel going clockwise here in this particular direction. And this particular flow here, and this is called the circular flow model, but this particular clockwise motion here is something that is known as the physical flow. And at one point, before we had a more service-oriented economy and where labor was much more representative of physical exertion, this was probably a very descriptive particular term, the physical flow. Today there's a sort of a slang term which has sort of come into usage, and a lot of people use it, especially to depict the opposite flow, and we call this red flow called the real economy, so-called real economy. And why it's real is for a number of reasons. Number one, it's easily observable, goods being transferred and people providing labor. So it's easy to see, and it differs from the flow which goes in the other direction, which is sometimes not as easy to see. And so what's the flow that goes in the other direction? It's simply a money flow, that goods aren't provided for free. Instead, there's got to be spending, in this case by households, and that is a dollar flow, or if we're talking about some other economy, a euro flow or a Japanese yen flow or whatever. And labor isn't provided for free. Instead, there's a money flow in the other direction, and so wages, which are also a dollar flow, go in that direction. And so you can see that the clockwise motion is exactly compensated for by the counterclockwise motion, and this outside ring here is simply something known as the financial flow. Or the so-called money economy. And to understand why this first flow here is known as the real economy, it goes back to the idea really of being observable and noticeable. And that is, it's not always obvious how much spending is going on, even though the goods might be apparent. And it's also not clear as to people's wages necessarily, particularly at a sort of a micro level. And so the financial flow is known as the money economy. And there are other bits and pieces to this, and as I mentioned at the outset, there are all kinds of different websites and resources and textbook illustrations which have other bits and pieces, and this is only just the very basics of this particular model, but it's one that should allow you to fully understand what's going on in these relationships. One thing we haven't talked about here is government, and as we go throughout the course, it's very possible to add government because both firms and households pay taxes. Also, government has spending that goes out to both of those actor groups. We can also include the financial markets as being a particular part of the economy. We can also include outside of the economy other particular actors like exporters and importers. And so, but this is the basics that sort of lays out these relationships among actors. And by the way, let's talk once real quickly about actors and what actors do. When households are spending money, we say that they're acting as consumers. And so that's their particular role, acting as consumers. But when the same households are going to work and earning a wage, we say that they are workers. The same people, but playing different roles. My role as a worker is much different from my role as a consumer. And likewise, when business firms are producing goods, we say that they act as producers. And when they're purchasing labor, we say that employers are acting, in this case, as employers. The same entity, but different kinds of roles, producers versus employers. And so I hope this was a helpful illustration to show you the relationships among actors and the various flows, both physical and financial, that tie all of the actor groups in the economy together.